Ravana, and I am a tutor here at Chegg, and today I will be discussing narrative structure. So narrative structure is made up of 6 main components: exposition, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, and denouement. So we're going to take a look at each of these 6 areas. Along with these 6 areas, I'm also going to provide you examples from 2 different texts, one being Romeo and Juliet and the other Great Gatsby. So the first section we're going to look at is exposition. And exposition really is where the story begins. In this case, exposition means the introduction of characters, situation, and setting for any particular story. So in the case of Romeo and Juliet, this was all done in the prologue. The setting is portrayed through the line "In fair Verona where we lay our scene." And the character and situation comes to light later in that same section with the line "Two star-crossed lovers take their life." Similarly, in The Great Gatsby, we soon discover that the narrator, Nick Carraway, has recently moved to New York and is visiting his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom Buchanan. So from here, we're looking at the second section. So the second section is conflict. And conflict, in this sense, is the major issue that takes place in the text, and it usually presents itself during the rising action. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, this is where they fall in love and then discover that Juliet is a Capulet and Romeo is a Montague. And this is also at the point when they decide to get married anyways, knowing that they had to keep it a secret. In the case of The Great Gatsby, this is when Nick is trying to provide details of the story of Gatsby to someone after all the other events in the book to come have already happened. From here, we're going to take a look at rising action. So rising action is this is where the conflict is further developed, so more details come into it, more scenes happen, and this is also the lead up to the major climax. In Romeo and Juliet, this is at the point when Tybalt attacks Romeo for essentially crashing the party at his uncle's home, and inadvertently kills Mercutio. Romeo, in anger, duels with Tybalt and kills him. In The Great Gatsby, this is when Nick finds out that Tom, his cousin's husband, is having an affair with a woman by the name of Myrtle, and then soon finds himself right after spending time with his cousin in the mistress's apartment. So after this, the next section comes the climax. And the climax is actually probably the most important section where narrative structure is considered. The reason behind this is this is the main turning point. This is when everything comes to a head. This is when the characters finally have a major moment. In this case, in Romeo and Juliet, it comes quite late in the story. But this is at the point when Romeo returns to Verona after facing exile and finds Juliet's body. Now, mind you, Juliet isn't actually dead, but he doesn't know this. And while he is in the tomb with her, Paris arrives and Romeo proceeds to kill him. In The Great Gatsby, this is where Nick begins to become good friends with Gatsby, while also discovering that Gatsby has been in love with his cousin Daisy for quite some time, and Nick provides this gateway for Daisy and Gatsby to be together again. After the climax, this is when things start to kind of go downhill. So this is where all the minor details are tied up. So yeah, the events that lead up to the end of the story. In Romeo and Juliet, this is the moment when Romeo commits suicide and Juliet awakens to find him dead, and in her grief commits suicide herself. In The Great Gatsby, this is when Daisy, after truly discovering that Tom was having an affair, she decides to try and leave with Gatsby, but in the meantime, she hits and kills Tom's mistress with Gatsby's car. The last section is Denouement, and Denouement is kind of where everything is wrapped up in a neat little package, and this means that everything's resolved, and in some cases everybody's happy or back to living normal lives. So this is where the conflict is resolved and also the end of the story. In Romeo and Juliet, this means this is where the friar explains all of the events that have taken place and explains to the families why everything has happened. And this is also where the Montagues and the Capulets decide that the grudge has to stop, because now both of the families have no children, and it's continued to build until this point when it completely destroys their lives. In The Great Gatsby, this is when Gatsby takes the blame for Myrtle's death, even though Daisy actually killed her. Gatsby is then shot by Myrtle's husband, believing that Gatsby is the one that Myrtle was having the affair with, and not really knowing that it was Tom Buchanan. Nick is heartbroken over this situation, and Daisy decides to move away with her husband, acting like nothing ever really happened. So if we take a quick look at the actual diagram here, you can see that we have a flat plateau where everything is good and happy, and then the conflict is introduced. Then everything that all the extra details need to make up the structure lead to the climax. Once the climax happens, you see a steady flow of details that are wrapping up into the present at the bottom, which is denouement, where everything is back to normal, where everything has been resolved. From here, if you have any more questions or concerns, or would just like more information on this, on narrative structure, please find me at the link below. Until next time.